Australians haven't seen anything like the bushfires currently tearing through their country. The conflagrations are obliterating landscapes and their ecosystems, reshaping the continent in irreparable ways. Bushfires aren't supposed to behave like this. In a normal world, every so often a lightning-sparked fire will roll through a landscape, clearing away old foliage to make way for the new. Such periodic, relatively mild fires allow many animals to escape. Birds fly away, and koalas shimmy farther up trees as fire burns the ground vegetation below. Insects and small mammals might even take refuge in a long wait to find out the firestorm passing above. But this is not a normal world. Climate change has supercharged these wildfires, turning whole landscapes into tinder. Fires are marching so fast across Australia that untold numbers of animals cannot escape, even kangaroos and birds, which should have the means. Quote, "The numbers are fairly hard to determine because nothing like this has happened before, especially across this scale," end quote, says University of New England entomologist Nigel Andrew, former president of the Ecological Society of Australia. Quote, "Previously, it's that fires have been patchy in their distribution. They haven't been completely taking out entire landscapes," end quote. The ferocious bushfires have killed at least 25 people, with 15 million acres scorched so far. On South Australia's Kangaroo Island, perhaps half of the koala population has been killed, and I think they estimate that's about 25,000. One estimate puts the bushfires' total tally at over 1 billion animals, billion with a B, birds and reptiles, but that doesn't include other animals like insects, whose toll could be much, much higher. One of Andrew's colleagues estimates that more than 3 trillion insects from one family alone, the rove beetles, may have perished so far. A note of caution here, though. Scientists have no way of knowing exactly how many organisms died. These calculations are done by scaling up species surveys done in smaller areas. We won't know the real toll for some time, but this much is clear. The bushfires burning in Australia have crippled iconic habitats that make the continent an ecological wonder. Not even the continent's rainforests, which typically can resist the advance of a blaze, are safe from the firestorm. Quote, "There will be a lot of species that are going to go extinct because of this," end quote, says Andrew. For species already threatened with extinction, already clinging to the edge, this may have been the swift and final blow. Australia is a continent of fire, and as such, its organisms are adapted to the flames. Some trees, for instance, time their germination to occur after a fire, when nutrients have been injected into the soil and fewer trees are competing for light and other resources. But seeds that can survive a typical bushfire might not be able to withstand these uber fires. Scientists won't know which species made it until the first rains come and they can watch what germinates. The decimation of a landscape's vegetation may draw in opportunists as well. Weedier species that grow quicker could take hold, perhaps turning what used to be a thick forest into a thinner, grassier one. Hardier invasive species could rapidly dominate. Quote, "A lot of the potential more charismatic or more unique species might not be able to survive in their natural landscapes," end quote, says Andrew. Quote, "So that's going to be the biggest issue. The diversity of our natural environments is going to change," end quote. Plants also make up a critical link in the food chain, and when they exit, so too does the food source for a range of animals. Even if plant eaters survive the blaze itself, they may starve in the aftermath. Quote, if the youngsters survive and their parents can't find enough food to produce milk," end quote, says Andrews. Quote, "Then the parents must just abandon the offspring so they can't survive," end quote. For animals that seek shelter in burrows during a typical wildfire, suffocation is a big risk, as these superfires suck the oxygen out of every crevice. Birds can become disoriented by smoke and extreme winds. These gusts are also pushing bushfires forward with unreal speed, blowing embers perhaps miles ahead of the fire front, setting new fires, a phenomenon known as spotting. Quote, "These animals are running forward, then running into another front," says Andrew. "So that's really unprecedented in terms of the ferocity of these fire fronts," end quote. Normally, animals like kangaroos might dart into the safety of a lush rainforest, yet the bushfire tears right through what used to be a refuge. The landscape is so parched, lightning strikes seem to be starting fires even within rainforests. Keep in mind that no single species lives in isolation. It feeds on other organisms, and other organisms feed on it. Losing one species in an ecosystem can have devastating ripple effects up and down the food chain. And losing an entire habitat to wildfire will have a downright apocalyptic effect on an ecosystem. Quote, "It's really difficult to know what will be able to bounce back from this," end quote, says Andrew. Quote, "And what does bounce back could be a very different type of flora, and also from that, different fauna," end quote. The question now, how can Australia's conservationists save species from this new age of supercharged fires? Well, they can go vegan for one thing. It'd be impossible for humans to rebuild an ecosystem from scratch at these scales, but in the aftermath of a fire, conservationists can help key species. One group of researchers has been experimenting with placing tunnels made of wire in burned environments. Quote, "Small animals can get inside, where they'll be protected from all the different predators that take advantage of the open country that the fire produces," end quote, says Don Driscoll, director of Deakin's University Centre for Integrative Ecology. Quote, "We know that foxes and cats, which are introduced here, they will travel long distances to get to these fire regions because it's easy pickings for them," end quote. Conservationists can also focus their efforts on the pockets where fire-threatened animals have managed to survive. Quote, "As ecologists, we've now got to not only understand what the climatologists predict will be the future, but also work out how we actually protect what refugia we've got left in these landscapes," said Michael Clark, an ecologist at La Trobe University. To do that, Australia might conduct controlled burns around critical habitats, creating a sort of barrier to stop approaching wildfires. Quote, "As an ecologist, that goes against my grain to be more interventionists, but I don't know what the alternative is," says Clark. Quote, "Do you stand by and say, quote, 'Sorry, they're gone, and there will be no sources in the future,' end quote? That doesn't sit well with me," end quote. Elsewhere in Australia, conservation groups are finding success with controlled burns. The organisation Bush Heritage, for example, manages fuel loads on its lands by burning vegetation during cool months when the control blazes won't get out of hand. It's too early in the fire season to say how well the strategy has worked, but they've had a number of lightning strikes on their lands and no rampant bushfires. Quote, "I think the fact that none of those fires has taken off and turned into an uncontrollable blaze is due to that preparation, is due to that really hard work," end quote, says Rebecca Spindler, the group's head of science and conservation. Control burns can be a tool, but they're not a panacea. Quote, "The capacity for a fire to burn through an area becomes less dependent on the amount of fuel the more extreme the weather is," end quote, says Driscoll. Quote, "So if it's really hot, it's really dry, and there's strong wind, then a fire requires very little fuel to burn right across it," end quote. To keep these conditions from getting even worse, there's only one solution: stop climate change. And I would add, and go vegan, but unfortunately, this is just the other inconvenient truth that green groups and conservationists and climatologists and scientists, a lot of them just pretend that that's not important or call it some sort of personal choice, when it's actually at this point, and it always was, but at this point with the climate crisis, the climate emergency, particularly in Australia, it is a moral imperative to go vegan. And why is that? Animals are not here for us to use. They never were. It's species that we ever thought that they were. They're just fellow earthlings on this planet, and they should have been left to just be able to live their life, just as we should have been leaving other humans to live their life. But we are a species that likes to dominate and to pillage and plunder, And unfortunately, we do it to our own species, and we do it to the more vulnerable on the planet, and that is the largest population on the planet that happen to be non-human. And we do that because we can. It's a human supremacist ideology that humans have about that we think that we're the quote-unquote crown of creation, and we think that we're entitled to dominate and exploit and enslave and so forth other animals who aren't able to fight back, who aren't able to prevent that from happening. So that's the first reason why we should be vegan, the most important reason, because veganism is an ethical position which rejects using animals for food. That's dairy, eggs, flesh, and it rejects animals that are used for clothing, entertainment, and other reasons. So they're sentient, and that's all that matters. Secondly, it's a moral imperative we go vegan because the climate crisis, because animal agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to the climate crisis. And I'll show you those two memes that I show from the largest study to date, 119 countries, 40,000 farms from farm to fork, 90% of all the foods we eat. And the conclusion to that largest study to date, published in Science, the journal Science, is that we should adopt a plant-based diet, and that's the single biggest action we can take to not only address the climate crisis, but also water shortages, land use, and eutrophication and acidification of the oceans, and so forth. It's better than stopping driving cars, better than taking plane flights, and so forth. So that's something that we can all do. And yes, it is the other inconvenient truth that groups like Extinction Rebellion like to pretend is not important. In fact, Extinction Rebellion has teamed up with Farms Not Factories, which is just a group, an organization that is helping promote quote-unquote sustained animal agriculture, in other words, small farms. And that's a nonsense, and I've done videos on why that is a nonsense, why this idea that you can, firstly, we don't have the right to use animals as resources, but secondly, it's just absolutely impossible to do this ridiculous sustained animal agriculture, and it still is. It's actually more damaging in some ways. If you look at the science about these grass-fed cows and so forth, it actually places more stress on the environment in the end, and still uses lots of land, and it uses tremendous amounts of water and so forth. So that's a ridiculous notion, and it's very sad that Extinction Rebellion would rather see us go extinct and taking most of the animals with us than because they value their taste pleasure over our survival. Anyway, that's really all I wanted to say, but it's very, very sad what's happening to the Australian landscape. But we can do something individually. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can be vegan. That is the first thing, for animals first, and then for the environment, and to significantly address the climate crisis. And then we can do nonviolent civil disobedience if we wish, and all the other things that we want to do. But we don't have to get permission from anyone to be vegan. We don't have to get permission from our parents or the governments or anything. And it's quite easy to be vegan. It's not expensive. Like, there's a whole lot of myths about it being expensive and elitist. Lots of countries used to have a plant-based diet because it was cheap and easy, and they were poorer countries. A plant-based diet, you don't have to be buying expensive pre-made vegan products. It's just grains, beans, and other vegetables and so forth. And that is really, really beneficial for our health, but it's beneficial for the climate crisis, and of course, most obviously, other animals. Anyway, thank you so much for tuning in. You can find this essay Wired in Wired magazine, and I'll leave a link to that. And so my name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Click the notifications bell, otherwise you don't receive notifications when I drop a video. Please click the like button if you like the content. So thanks for watching. And please check out my vegan podcast, howtogovegan.org. It's a comprehensive vegan resource in podcast form. Check that out. So thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye for now.